So around mid-2015, I began noticing games that were adding a twist to their gameplay. The games in question were Life is Strange, Undertale, and later Soma and Until Dawn. Traditional mechanics that were very familiar with, were leading to unexpected outcomes. So I became curious as to the nature of these twists, the effects they had on gameplay, and more importantly, the personal experiences players had to these unexpected outcomes. Stories have cliches, but games do too, in their gameplay and in their stories. There are gameplay tropes we recognize and instinctively react to. There's nothing wrong with these mechanics and story scenarios being typical with very expected outcomes. However, because players are so well versed in them, there's now the opportunity to do the unexpected with them. And that was what I was noticing in these aforementioned games. It's important to note what contrary game design is and what it is not. There are games that use subversion of mechanics or scenarios to troll players, or gameplay experiences like spoiler alert that are upfront about the subversion of their mechanics. So players aren't taken by surprise and the gameplay doesn't challenge their expectations. In contrary game design, the subversion of the mechanics and or scenarios opposes player expectations. The potential for throwing players curveballs, for confronting them with outcomes they're not expecting, is immense. Serious and educational games might use contrary game design as a learning tool. Simulations and other games used for training or teaching techniques might alter patterns or disrupt routines. Things don't always go according to plan, so players shouldn't expect them to. Providing players with good old entertainment value and new experiences is reason enough. But beyond that, players can look at new ways to solve problems. This can be specific to the way they retrain themselves to play a game and or even extend to how they tackle real-world issues. Players can get new perspectives. Games can encourage play styles that are unusual to them. The gameplay may not only get them to consider new ways to play, but it may also get them to understand why other people make the choices they do outside of games. Players can develop new skill sets when they're faced with unfamiliar challenges. In order to subvert a mechanic, we need to understand how players approach them. A player's understanding of a mechanic can change ever so slightly depending on the genre. This also means that if players are not familiar with a certain genre, the subversion of a gameplay scenario or mechanic typical to that genre will be lost on them. Looking at the meanings of mechanics and scenarios can help us anticipate what players will expect. Mechanics, systems, and scenarios symbolize real-world actions and behaviors, becoming metaphors of them. Here are only a few. A twitch reaction is a picture of protection, defense, or even aggression. When multiple enemies approach, or what seem to be enemies approach, players will be able to protect themselves. Environment, interaction, or exploration is discovery. This is why players come to understand the world they're inhabiting and what they can do within. Targeting is a metaphor of hunting, or taking the role of predator. Players go on the offense. Healing is recovery, rejuvenation, a moment to catch one's breath. Healing avoids death, and players may be desperate to find a way to heal. Dialogue trees are one-on-one FaceTime. Players can get to know NPCs and get valuable information that can help them progress in the game. Players can choose how much they get to know NPCs or the world they inhabit when dialogue is optional. And then there's animation loops, which are pictures of hunting patterns and behaviors. Players can learn the habits of enemy NPCs, mini-bosses, and bosses to either evade or defeat them. Looking at healing a little closer, when you find that heart or you're able to drink a potion and you're near death, you tend to relax. You've refilled your health bar. You're out of trouble. In Soma, and this is a spoiler, healing drains a console's power. Draining power makes a lot of noise, and that noise draws proxies or the hideous monsters to your location. So you're not allowed to relax. The act of healing can lead to your death. An arbitrary subversion or a poorly chosen time to subvert the mechanic can convey unintended messages. We sometimes intentionally or unintentionally telegraph to players that they're playing a right or wrong way. Some games even label their endings as good or bad. It's possible that players' internal moral codes dictate whether they believe they've done the right or wrong things. However, subversion should not manipulate player agency or dictate to players how they should play. Once players think we're telling them there's a proper way to handle subversions, we're robbing them of their unique gameplay experience. Whatever they take away from the mechanic subversion is lost with it. We shouldn't potentially come across as preachy or that we're giving them the right answer, especially if the goal is to teach a new technique or skill or provide a glimpse into another perspective. We should let players bring their own insights to their experience within the subversion. Players can also feel they're being trolled when they're expecting one thing, another happens, and the players end up feeling manipulated. If players expect that they can take their sweet time before they have to go and save the world, and the game says, nope, now everyone's dead because you took too long, they can feel punished because they weren't given a warning. Contrary game design shouldn't feel like it's punishing players or catching them in oops, gotcha moments. Surprise for the sake of surprise. Subversion should feel logical and that there's a reason for their existence, such as in Life is Strange using the common sense notion that people can't know something unless they go searching for information. Player character Max's characterization is that she's nosy. And aren't player characters nosy in a lot of games, going through people's stuff all the time? In this game, however, other characters note how nosy she is. So this is a narrative design explanation for the game's exploration, going through other characters' things and learning things about them. If you don't explore, and a lot of players don't care for it, Max isn't going to know how to respond to some desperate situations. She hasn't found the information, and that's going to impact other characters. In other games, exploration isn't vital to the game's outcome. An entire game can subvert all of its mechanics and scenarios, like Undertale, which literalizes RPG mechanics and gameplay. EXP stands for execution points, because the game acknowledges you're going around killing living things. And LV, which we probably would think of as level, is short for LOVE, or level of violence. Again, the game is acknowledging that in RPGs, we go around murdering beings. However, it might be best to map out when to use these subversions. Subversion can only be a surprise when it's unanticipated. If it happens too often, players can get used to it and slip into similar instinctual responses, as they do with cliched mechanics and scenarios. While playing Life is Strange, non-explorers wanted to get as much information as they could once they understood the potential consequences they might face. After the harrowing end to Episode 2, several non-explorer Let's Players were more conscious of exploring in Episode 3 and said things like, I want to make sure I don't miss anything before progressing. By Episode 4, they were back to their normal behaviors and playstyles. There was no major event to reinforce the importance of exploration. Life is Strange has a rewind time mechanic as well. It's often used to keep characters from being seriously injured or killed, but it can be used to rewind conversations and try out new dialogue choices. The mechanic is particularly useful in conversations when players learn new information, can rewind to ask the character something based on that new information, and gain new insight. Earlier episodes remind players of the ways the mechanic can be used and why they're helpful. Episode 5, however, doesn't mention anything about the mechanic. Some non-explorers may not have explored anyway. However, since the episodes were released months apart, mentioning the feature again would have reminded them of the choice to rewind or not. Until Dawn has a similar problem. Some players might choose to harm animals. However, because most players are used to Twitch reactions, they might press a button to attack instinctually when they don't mean to. Early on, the game instructs that players don't always have to react, but the reminder would have been helpful later. We have to remember that instinctual responses are ingrained. Players are going to fall back into old patterns of behavior if there's not some kind of communication to get their attention. So we can design feedback systems in order to guide players out of their patterns and learn responses. Text on the screen every once in a while is helpful, but there can be more elegant ways of doing this. A good reinforcement occurs through the gameplay itself. If players connect an immediate result to their actions, they can decide if they want the result to happen again. This is true in Life is Strange when players who didn't care to explore made it a priority as a direct result of Episode 2's ending. We can also use art. The environment itself may respond to the player's behavior. In Soma, when the player character heals himself, lights dim and flicker. If players are conscious of the monsters around them and that healing could sound an alarm, they might wait to heal. With sound effects, music, and cues, the electronics around the player character also make noise when the player character heals in Soma. Sound alerts the proxies. Music and sound effects can convey the emotional tone of happiness, it can be discordant, or it can change slightly to suggest a state change. In Undertale's genocide route, the soundtrack switches to a macabre and creepy track when the player has killed all of the monsters in an area. We can also use ambient dialogue. Other characters can respond to a player's actions, whether they approve or disapprove. We should be careful, however, to not make it seem as if these characters are stand-ins for the designers. And then there's also physical renderings of the mechanics. A visual can show players the options they have right in front of them, like the crosshairs appearing on the animals on Until Dawn. Health and attack meters can also suggest that players can choose to attack NPCs or creatures. I created a really simple game to show how the concept of contrary game design can work, and I came up with this worksheet to help brainstorm how it would function in the game. It asks you to come up with a scenario, think about the metaphor of the mechanics you're using, how the player might respond, and what feedback systems you might use. Also, it asks you to think about how you avoid punishing the player or telling them how they should play. So, Christy, you played Do You Want to Go Home? Was there anything you found that subverted your expectations?
Yes, there was a couple of points, and I'm interested to hear about how you engineered that.
Well, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to code anything, so there weren't going to be any mechanics, that the player was going to be experiencing in gameplay. So I thought, okay, what's a typical setting that I can put in like a text-based form? And a typical video game setting is the high fantasy. So I thought about having players interacting with NPCs and also like some looting capabilities, like you can loot a potion for your health. You're not as strong as the NPCs, and you can loot money if you defeat some of the enemy NPCs. And so I thought, what are typical things that tend to happen, when players talk with NPCs? And then I thought, what could I leave as, expected, and then what could I subvert? So in this particular scenario, there are 3 ethnic groups that live in your country. All of the ethnic groups have had strained relationships. Some sorcerers come and they overtake and colonize your land. You are extremely poor. You go to a faraway land to make money to send home to your family, but you get word that your children are desperately ill, and so you come home. And as you're arriving home, you're almost home and on the road, and there's a fork in the road. There are 2 sets of NPCs. There are the ethnicities that are your countrymen, and then there are the NPCs that are the enemy sorcerers. So first of all, one thing that usually happens in dialogue, if you have to make a choice, is that you look for the option of, no, I will not make this choice. And the NPCs do something that's like, no, you must make this choice. We're not letting you get out of this. The game doesn't let the player make that choice at all. And with the ethnic groups, they're like, we're supplicants of our God. You have to kill one of us. We've been waiting for the gods to respond to our prayers, and they have sending you. You say, look, I'm not going to kill either of you. And they're like, no, we'll kill you if you don't kill one of us. So they make their case. Each makes their case. One is old, one is young. They make their case for why they should be sacrificed. And so that's kind of a subversion in and of itself, because in the scenario, you would think your countrymen, the people who have been in this country with you, enduring the same, circumstances under colonization, would be a little bit more empathetic. So that's kind of a subversion in and of itself. And then with the enemy NPCs, if you try to attack them without taking, sorry, I said a health potion, it's actually an attack buffer. Without taking the attack buffer, they will kill you. If you take the attack buffer, you can kill them and then loot them, loot their gold, and then go home with $300 extra in your pocket, which would be very helpful for your family. However, if you choose to talk to them, you explain your circumstances and that you've been away and that your children are very ill. And they say to you, oh, we've been away from home for so long as well. And they empathize with you, and they teleport you right to your door, which is the unexpected thing there, that, your enemy has a human connection with you. And so usually when I play it, I read it to the player. And the very first time I did so, the player went through all the different options, and he got to the talk to the enemy NPCs option, and they empathized with him. He was like, I did not expect that. And I'm like, contrary game design. So
we'll provide a link in Twitter so other people can check out this mini example of contrary design. But one of the things I love about this is I like surprises that are logical as well. You know, not a cheesy manipulation of, like, as you say, the gotcha. You know, and it has a relationship with literariness, where, you know, some say that if something has literary qualities, then it's taking you in areas that you seriously have not been before, and the idea is that you've been through lots of places, you've read lots of things, you've done lots of things, but you're still being pushed and surprised, and in justified ways. So I see an overlap there.
Yeah, and I come to games from, you know, the literary perspective. I was a prose fiction writer first, and then I started with creative nonfiction. And prose does great things with subversion. It's actually one of the things we're taught to do, and of course we're not told to overdo it, because, you know, then it becomes, you know, obvious. But even if we look at TV and films, they're starting to do it a little bit. Like the anti-hero protagonist, or the just plain villain protagonist, like Walter White in Breaking Bad. Walter White is a trash bag of a human being, yet we still follow his story. We're enthralled with him. Some people even still rooted for him because he was the protagonist. We're trained to root for the protagonist. But, you know, we experience how he ruined the lives and ruined the families of all these people around him, and we started rooting for the families. You know, we rooted for people to get him. The manga Death Note does the same with Light Yagami, who's a sociopath who gets the right supernatural weapon to act out on his sociopathy. So little things like that, I think, are really important. I think it's important that we look to other storytelling media. Like, metaphors are great for games. Also, personal experience. I think we can do more with personal experience in our game design. We're starting to see it with games like Papo and Yo and Bat Dragon Cancer. And, you know, both of those games take metaphors. Bat Dragon Cancer literalizes them sometimes. And Papo and Yo takes the metaphor of a monster who is very friendly, but then turns into a fiery hellbeast, as a metaphor for an abusive alcoholic father. So we can do a lot with metaphors and other literary devices in games.
Yeah, well, yeah, especially anything that's about effect. You know, that's where we connect. That's where the art forms connect. Is it's effect on people. And those techniques. So, what do you have for us as a task?
Okay, so I do have a prompt for you, and you have 4 mini prompts within this one exercise. So first, come up with 2 mechanics that players often encounter in games, and then think about the real-world actions and or behaviors that these mechanics are metaphors of. Then come up with a story scenario players often encounter in games, and then think about how you would subvert the 2 mechanics in the story scenario. So think about how you would keep players from feeling like they're playing the wrong way or being punished when you are analyzing these mechanics and scenarios and subverting them, and then try to anticipate how players usually respond to these mechanics and the story scenarios, and what a subversion might communicate to them.
Yeah, meaning and the subversion, and as you know, we've spoken about the justification. So real world actions and mechanics. Do you want to elaborate on what you mean there?
So I mentioned Selma earlier about healing, and healing is usually like, okay, I get to take a break now, because usually in a game, if you are very low on health and you know you're about to die, you are very wary of taking another hit. However, once you heal, you're like, okay, if something comes and attacks me, you know, I can handle it. But you can't do that in Soma, because healing will draw things to you, and you might have to strategize about when you can heal. You have to make sure you have enough distance between you and the proxies. Otherwise, you might be enclosed in a space and can't escape. So if you think about, you know, trying to eat more healthy in your own life, and you're doing all the right things, you're eating all the right food, but you happen to eat a food that you don't know you're allergic to, and you end up in the hospital or dead. That would be metaphor.
Yeah, and you don't need to entwine the mechanics in the stories. Like you can take that as two different tasks to do.
Right. You have a choice here. You can either look at the mechanics and the story separately, or if you want to come up with one game concept and then the mechanics and the story scenario are part of the game concept, you could do that as well.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.